Hi, everyone. My name is Chris White, and this is the second installment of the book chapter interviews for our recent book that came out, which is Appalachian Epidemics. Let me make sure you can see that on the screen there, like that. Okay. Which came out with University Press of Kentucky just last month, or I guess back in December. And I wanted to just talk a little bit about how the book came about before we actually talk to our interviewee today, Nicole Fijman. Just briefly, I teach at Marshall University, and around March 6th, so about a week before the COVID lockdowns, I was in Salt Rock, West Virginia, waiting on my son to finish basketball practice. And there's this little library there with a little special collections, and they had all these death records from a southern county in West Virginia going back to the mid to late 1800s. And what was so extraordinary about this is that pretty much everybody who died back then died of some type of infectious disease, whether it was tuberculosis, which they called consumption back then, or any number of other diseases too, measles, even some died of smallpox, but a lot of them were things like dysentery, diphtheria, things that we don't really think about very much today. And so that led to the creation of a co-edited volume with my colleague Kevin Barksdale, and we reached out to all kinds of authors. And one of the things that fascinated me the most was the extraordinary outsized impact that insects like, especially mosquitoes, have had on human history and in particular epidemic history too. And so we're going to be talking to Nicole Fijman today, who is a data scientist who studied Aedes mosquitoes at the University of Southern Mississippi, and her chapter is called Small Bite, Big Impact, the Insect That Shapes History. And I found out about Nicole's research on mosquitoes through Deanne Stevens, who we're going to talk about too as well. She's a historian at Southern Mississippi who wrote a great book on yellow fever, and she wrote a fever chapter for us in the book as well about a region of northern Mississippi in particular that's part of Appalachia. So Deanne recommended you for the volume, and I'm so glad that she did because I learned so much, and I know our readers will too. Welcome to the program, Nicole.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So you bet. So can you tell us what is it that got you first interested in mosquitoes?
Yeah, so I always knew growing up that I wanted to, focus my studies and career in science, and I always knew I wanted to help people. And so, a long, tumultuous, winding road that led me to getting my master's in biology. And so I was interviewing at the University of Southern Mississippi, and my advisor told me about a really exciting opportunity studying mosquitoes. And so I didn't even know that that was like a possibility. And I was like, this is amazing. I can kind of bridge my love for science and my passion for science with helping people with the medical aspect of mosquitoes. And so, yeah, I had to really learn a lot about insects. And I had to learn to not be scared of them when you catch them. We had a whole class where we had to do a big collection of, I think it's like 100 different insects. And so, we would catch them and collect them and pin them. So I really learned a lot, but my passion for mosquitoes specifically started in my grad school.
And what is it that makes mosquitoes such effective vectors for the transmission of disease?
Yeah, so they are just, it's really interesting. I mean, there's 300 different species in the world, and all different mosquitoes carry different pathogens. So what happens for disease transmission in mosquitoes is they bite an infected animal, and so that could be a human, that could be a bird, a chipmunk, a squirrel. They take in that virus and it multiplies in their stomach. And then when they bite another, you know, whatever it is, animal, human, in our case is human, that then some of the blood and the virus that has been multiplying in their stomach then comes out into the human. So that bite actually injects some of this previous blood into human blood. And that's how this pathogen gets into our bloodstream. So it's really interesting, yeah, how mosquitoes have become this really big impact in human health. And they can live and breed so easily and quickly. Insects have such short life cycles, and they can lay so many eggs, so they just are able to multiply so quickly too.
How long do they usually live?
It kind of depends. The average larval stage, so when they're aquatic, is around 2 weeks, depending on how much nutrients is in their environment. And then as adults, they can last around 2 weeks as well, maybe a little bit more or a little less, depending on the species.
And of course, that stagnant water is essential to the proliferation of mosquitoes as well, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. So mosquitoes lay their eggs in stagnant water. So different mosquitoes specialize in different sort of containers. So there's tree hole mosquitoes that look for those holes in trees that have water. There's Aedes aegypti, which I did a lot of research on. They really prefer man-made containers, which is very interesting. So tires, is in cemeteries, like when you have like fake flowers sitting in vases. It's very interesting. We did a lot of research where we'd go to cemeteries and pour out the water from the vases, but in there, there's standing water, and mosquitoes will go into it and lay their eggs. Yogurt containers, they've really adapted and evolved to lay their eggs in any kind of stagnant water. And then other mosquitoes will be more like lake driven. So some genuses will lay their eggs in lakes. And so that's why you see in like Minnesota, they have so many lakes and they also have so many mosquitoes. And those are different mosquitoes than the ones that lay their eggs in human containers.
Wow. So, which ones are becoming prevalent or could become more prevalent in Appalachia?
Yeah, so there's a few that I look at specifically. One of them is Aedes aegypti and Aedes albopictus. Those two are pretty similar in their behaviors, and those are really, we call them anthropomorphic. And so they really prefer to bite humans, they prefer to be near humans, and they prefer to lay their eggs in human containers. So those are really, I would say, some of the more scary mosquitoes. Those are the ones that will transmit Zika, dengue, chikungunya, some of the big mosquito-borne vectors or viruses that you hear about. Another one can be the Aedes triceratus, and so that one is in the same genus as Aegypti and Albopictus, but they're more forest focused. So those really prefer tree holes, not as much humans. Some of their source vectors will be like chipmunks and squirrels, and they'll feed on humans if there's no other like small mammals around. And then Culex pipiens, which are also more like prefer a natural climate. So like
I
tree
see.
holes and such. Mhm.
And so, not all the 300 mosquito species that are out there also transmit diseases to humans. Is that right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's really interesting. My advisor actually wrote a paper on this, but it's really hard to kind of nail down what mosquito species actually transmit vectors. And so there's three different kinds, or maybe two different kinds of actually like disseminating a virus. So you can have in the wild, in the real life, a mosquito can transmit a vector or a virus, and then you can also have lab simulated. So, I have a Aedes aegypti and I infect it with a, virus of, whatever we decide to infect it with, and then we see if we then put some sort of blood meal in there. They take that blood meal from an animal, and then that animal gets infected. So maybe albopictus has the ability to transmit a certain disease in the lab, but we haven't technically seen that in the wild. So there's kind of a few classes of vectors. So, there's lab vectored and there's actual in the wild vector. And so not all of them vector human pathogens. I don't know the exact amount that do, but yeah, it's not all 300 mosquitoes species.
Okay. Yeah. And I think that's important too because a lot of like it's as you say in the chapter too, it's not as if the human or the mosquitoes or Timothy Weingart actually says this as well. It's not the mosquitoes themselves that are actually the heart, they're not the reservoir hosts of this. They're actually just transmitting it from the reservoir host between different species, right?
Yes.
And that's how we get infected.
Yeah, so there's two kind of like interesting ways we can think about that with the reservoir species. So one, which you talked about, Deanne talking about her research on yellow fever. So yellow fever's host is primarily in humans. So humans will that's where the virus lives and multiplies. And so for yellow fever to transmit, you have to have yellow fever infected in humans, like in the US. And so it's a lot easier to control vectors that host populations are humans because you can control, you tell people like don't, cover up your clothes, use uh spray, I forget what it's
Yeah.
called now,
Yeah,
insecticide.
insecticide.
You can make sure that your containers don't have water. So it's a lot easier to kind of eradicate these things, which is something we've seen with yellow fever, which is so interesting. As soon as we found out what was causing it and how to get rid of these mosquito hosts, it was really easy to be able to like prevent people from getting bit by mosquitoes, and therefore no more mosquitoes had yellow fever. I think it, yeah, so that's really interesting. I think it technically comes from primates in Africa, but since then, the yellow fever virus that we get is hosted in humans. And then you also have West Nile, which is very interesting, something that is present in Appalachia and, across the US, and its host species is in birds. And so, as a population, we can't really control what birds have West Nile. It's not something that kills them, it's just something that lives in them. And so, um, like the Culex pipiens will their preferred blood meal is from a bird. And so they may have, they feed on a bird, they like multiply West Nile, they feed on another bird. It doesn't really impact humans. But then as soon as that mosquito doesn't have a bird blood meal in sight, that's when they then come and bite a human. And so it's a lot harder to eradicate something like West Nile because, unless we killed all of the birds, which is something I'm not advocating for, it's really hard to get rid of that like host vector.
Right. Yeah, that's it's so interesting too. It kind of reminds me of that One Health concept where we're kind of all part of the same ecosystem. And so, I mean, if you try to eradicate something, then you really have to take into consideration all the different types of, well, the vectors, but also the reservoir host and the transmission cycle. And in the case of yellow fever and malaria, they were able to, as I understand it, the first half of the century, they were able to kill enough species or enough of the mosquitoes that were in fact, transmitting it to people, between people, that is. And then, even though the species are still here, right? We still got Anopheles
Yes.
and Aedes aegypti and all
Yep.
that. The same ones
Exactly.
that carry it in Africa and in Latin America, they don't
Hmm.
have it. They don't have the host population. They don't have the humans to transfer between.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
And so, what are some of the most important factors that are affecting their spread in the United States, in the world, but also in Appalachia? Because it does seem like mosquitoes themselves are actually spreading further north and into other places too, right?
Yeah, so there's two big climate factors that impact, all mosquitoes. And so that is temperature and precipitation. So temperature, the big kind of factor that will impact their range is the minimum winter temperature. So they have a temperature where they can no longer live, but their eggs can overwinter. So in Appalachia, if that species can exist, it doesn't reach colder than like, whatever temperatures their eggs can exist over winter, but maybe above that, maybe in Maine, it is too cold. So let's say you have one of these mosquitoes, get up to Maine, they live for the summer, they, eggs, whatever. Then in the winter, all of those mosquitoes die out because their eggs can't overwinter in Maine because it's too cold. Now, as the climate gets hotter, especially in the winter, we can find that these eggs are able to last the winter and therefore expand their range more and more north. So that's one thing that's definitely part of part of the factors that impact where they're able to live. And the other one is precipitation. So precipitation, as you mentioned before, they lay their eggs in water, which is very important. So it's really interesting. These eggs that overwinter, they lay them in whatever container they prefer. So a tire, a tree hole. They lay them on above a water's edge. And when those eggs are inundated with water, so a rain happens, it's warm enough, and then a rain happens, that's when those eggs hatch. So these mosquitoes are laying their eggs saying, well, when the water gets up to this line, we feel like there will be enough of an environment for my, mosquito babies to live. And so, which is super interesting. So you also need this precipitation. So I think with the increasing, precipitation, with increasing temperature, these mosquitoes will be able to expand their climates. I think really the the temperature will expand it more, north, and with precipitation, we could see a longer mosquito season. If we get rains earlier, if we get, earlier and later into the season, then maybe these mosquitoes can last, longer rather than just like the summer, which is what you typically think of.
Right. And according to pretty much all researchers on climate, we're the ones that are affecting it the most, right?
Yes.
In addition to
Yep.
the fact that you talk about things like man-made items like yogurt containers and tires and all that, I mean, these
Yeah.
are things that we haven't figured out ways to create them in ways that would deter the laying of mosquito eggs.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sounds
It's
silly to even say
really,
it, yeah.
yeah. Yeah. It's really, really crazy.
Well, and I
Um,
wanted to show also the viewers too that you have all these maps, so many maps in here where you plotted all of these projections too out to tw
mhm.
2080 to 2100. Can you talk about some of those? What are you expecting should happen in places like Appalachia in particular?
Yeah. So typically, in what I think will happen in Appalachia is that the areas that are currently suitable will become more suitable. So you may have a higher density. You may have a longer range of mosquitoes in areas that you already have them. So, that mosquito population is just going to grow with these factors, being more suitable to mosquitoes, as well as expanding their reach, north and even west as well. So I think that their range will definitely expand and their densities will also increase.
Wow. Well, that's all very scary. Can you do you have a sense of what could be done to mitigate the expansion of these?
Mitigate the expansion.
Yeah.
Um, I my some of my friends joke that I'm the PR team for mosquitoes because
Yeah.
I'll always tell them, good things about mosquitoes, like they're pollinators, which people really don't know.
Oh,
But very interesting. I think to mitigate this, I mean, one, we as humans should probably stop, contributing to climate change as much as we are.
yeah.
Something that we're not going to fix here. But I think really like the most important thing, I think to me, is being able to have these really precise maps and species distribution in like right now, so that let's say something does happen. Let's say we have dengue in Appalachia. We already have the mosquito. We have someone that goes to South America, gets dengue, comes back. And then because we have the mosquito that can transmit it, we start this like local transmission of dengue. What we need to know to combat that is where are these mosquitoes? Do we have reliable maps? Do we have reliable data? What is the best way to treat these to then, like you said before, target the mosquitoes that are the ones that are, spreading this disease. So I think that like things that we can really do is have really good methods of tracking and, you know, plans for containment if something like that happens.
Yeah, it seems like a very important public health measure. And of course, we had this going on during COVID too, where they're trying to map all the positive cases, right?
Yeah.
And then they could determine, and they could also take samples of people too to see what kinds of genetic traits these new
Yeah.
new traits, or what do you call it, new strains had. Um, and as opposed to a medical intervention, right, which is almost like the last resort.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I tell you, I mean, even though it is a scary thing, I really enjoy learning about mosquitoes in our conversations that we've had, and also in reading the research here, because they are fascinating. It's not that, I mean, when a mosquito lands on me, I want to do everything I can to kill it. When I see, and everybody else feels that way too, obviously, but then you think, wait a minute, they're innocent in all of this, right?
They're innocent. And one of my favorite fun facts is that only female mosquitoes bite because they need the blood to produce eggs. So the proteins that we have in our blood and animals have in their blood are needed to create eggs. So they're just trying to be a good mom.
Wow. I like that. Well, gosh, as always, you've taught me so many cool and scary things that I can't wait to tell my classes about, and I'll be sure to credit you too. So, thank you so much, Nicole Fijman. And for those of you who want to read more about mosquito disease spread and potential prevention efforts in Appalachia, check out our book, Appalachian Epidemics. I'll show the front cover again. Wait a minute, it's upside down. There you go. And Nicole's chapter is on mosquitoes. And so you can read her chapter. You can read the whole book too. You can get it on Amazon, but you can also get it at the University Press of Kentucky, along with many other diseases. We've got Deanne Stevens's chapter on yellow fever. We've got smallpox and measles and I mean, polio and black lung and all that kind of stuff too. So thanks again.
Yep. Thank you.
You bet.